Welcome to the first episode of the 2025 Dynamic Leadership Series. This series kicks off a journey designed to help you lead your business in a way that drives results while creating an environment where people can thrive as part of your team. This series is the culmination of years of working with leaders and teams and is built on a simple but powerful idea. Leadership doesn't have to be overwhelming or complicated, but it does have to be intentional. Over the coming months, I'll guide you step by step through the concepts, principles, and practical tools that make up dynamic leadership. Now, if you're wondering, what exactly is dynamic leadership? Let me break it down. At its core, dynamic leadership is about meeting the needs of your people in a way that drives intrinsic motivation and long-term success. It's a leadership style that adapts to challenges while staying grounded in proven principles. Today, we'll focus on 5 core agreements that set the foundation for this leadership approach. If these resonate with you, you'll likely find value in adopting dynamic leadership for yourself and your organization. The first one, the brain is over 100,000 years old and not likely to change materially. This means that our instincts, reactions, and core needs are rooted in ancient survival mechanisms. As leaders, we have to understand how to work with the brain's wiring, not against it. It makes sense, right? Why put the toothpaste back in the tube when you can squeeze it out in the right place to begin with? People spend 2/3 of their waking hours at work during a 5-day work week. Think about that. 2/3 of their time is with you and your organization. As leaders, we have an incredible opportunity to influence how that time is experienced. Consider that humans have needs, and they're going to eat, they're going to sleep, but during that 8 to 10 hours that they're with you in the workplace, they have other needs as well, and that's what we'll get into, and it's at the core of intrinsic motivation. Third, human needs will be met, either in a way that serves the organization or doesn't. The question isn't whether needs will be met, but how. Effective leaders create environments where needs are met in ways that align with the organization's goals and values. You may think about this in the context of pursuing compliance. And it seems like, I don't know if you're familiar with the game Whack-A-Mole, you hit this mole and it goes down, but then another one pops up. And you're trying to stay ahead, but they keep popping up. It's like that for me when I think about getting compliance with people who don't want to comply. It's going to come out somewhere. That energy goes somewhere. It comes out somewhere, and often it comes out in defiance. Getting compliance just for compliance is not effective. It's not sustainable. What we want to do is, by using intrinsic motivation, get the people to want to do the things that the organization needs. That's the stuff we'll be talking about. The fourth agreement, effective leadership follows protocols. Just like in sports, where success relies on practicing the fundamentals, leadership has its own set of protocols. When you understand and apply them, you create consistency and clarity for your team. 5, organizations need both project and operational excellence. It's not enough to excel at one or the other. Dynamic leadership ensures you're managing the day-to-day operations and executing strategic projects that drive growth. Throughout today's discussion, I'll explore how these agreements tie into concepts like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the 6 human needs, and self-determination theory. These are powerful frameworks that can transform how you think about leadership and what it means to build a thriving organization. By the end of our time together today, my goal is for you to walk away with clarity about why dynamic leadership matters for small businesses that are intent on growing and scaling, and how it can help you create a roadmap for growth, both for your business and your people. Later in this series, I'll introduce a regularly scheduled Q&A to address real-world questions as they arise for you. There are several leadership approaches or styles that you could consider. In looking at the broader landscape and having been involved deeply in command and control, servant leadership, participative leadership, none of those are one size fits all. They all have gaps, and those gaps exist. And unless you find a way to fill them, you're going to have some blind spots. I'll just give you a quick example. Command and control, which was very, very popular in the 70s and the 80s. It served a lot of the companies during the baby boom era when that group was moving through the workplace. However, when you look at command and control, where it really works is in the military, right? And in the military, you have a lot of levers that can be pulled. Anything from just threatening or putting in a suspended action where if they do it again, money will be taken from them, or perhaps you could take away freedoms, all the way up to court-martial. And it's also in the military, it doesn't take anything to relieve somebody from a position. Think about that in the context of an organization where you are dealing with performance management. Firing somebody there's a lot of requirements that surround that. In the military, at least in the United States, a person can be relieved of command or relieved from their duties, and then they'll just be put into a different position. They usually maintain their rank, although that could be knocked down, but they'll typically hold their rank but just get reassigned. It's a lot different than thinking about it in terms of firing somebody. My point in bringing that out is that command and control works because there's these levers that can be pulled, and it's always the person's choice. Do they want to go through that next door or stay where they are? And the next door is always worse than where they are. And that's why it works. We can't recreate that in the workplace, at least in the US, because there's just laws. There's laws, there's protocols, you have consumer behavior. We've all seen where consumers would react to something that a company is doing with their workforce. So command and control is one that it has its place, but you have to understand where and when to use it. Dynamic leadership sits on a continuum between command and control and servant leadership. Now, on the other end, you have the servant leadership, and this is typical. You see this in sales organizations where the top salespeople are able to get certain perks, and they have certain allowances because they're producing so much. Well, that has limits as well. And of course, it works to a degree in the sales environment because there's commissions. It's presumed that those salespeople will rise to the occasion and will do the job that's necessary because of the commission. However, we know from experience in years and years, you can go back and look at bonuses, you can look at commissions. People are always leaving money on the table. It's not a panacea. Now, you can add recognition. This is another way to get the best performers to rise up to that next level. You can have recognition. And if you think about it in the context of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'll be talking about today, the challenge is there's always going to be a cap, because at some point it's easier for them to get that need met in other ways than it is to sell more product, for example. And then you could add another level. Sometimes they have things like the inner circle or the president's club or something like that. And that's where you can take the best of the best and they can meet with the senior staff. And then that gets into self-determination theory where you have some relatedness. So you're adding in needs to the incentive program. And a takeaway from there, I'm not saying don't use servant leadership. What I'm saying is they all have limits and they have a place, and you want to know what works where, when, and how. And to take away from this last part of the conversation about incentives, it makes sense to have a commission structure that increases the payment as production goes up. So once they hit a threshold, their the commission percentage goes up. They hit another threshold, the percentage goes up. It's not a panacea, but it does bring people up, and it limits the amount of money that gets left on the table. Then after that, you have recognition. You have a recognition area, and I don't like to think of this as a zero-sum game. The recognition should be a level. Once they hit a certain level, then they're recognized with a trip or special award, something, right? Now you're getting into the esteem need. But then after that, as I said, there's going to be a point where it's easier for them to just take the money that they've made and pay for the trip themselves than to do the extra work. But you can get some more people off the sidelines by adding in an opportunity where they can interact with the senior leadership team, the CEO, the president, sales vice president, etc. And it does two things. One, it taps into the relatedness need in terms of self-determination theory. It also taps into that competence, feeling of competence. It also builds on the esteem need. If you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you could see it in a sense where there's some self-actualization, because now this person is able to sit shoulder to shoulder at dinner, for example, with the president of the company, and can have some influence with the organization, and that fuels that self-actualization need. So if you're tracking with me, what I'm talking about is looking at incentives, but also looking at human needs. I talked about the 5 agreements. If you agree on these 5 things, then I think you'll also see the value in dynamic leadership. So I start with these, and these will carry a theme throughout. I've already touched on it a bit. But first, we have the brain. The human brain is over 100,000 years old. Now, you'll see this stated as a couple of million years old. That's because the base, the amygdala, the old animal brain, etc. But by saying it's greater than 100,000 years old, it captures all of that. That's important because we could spend our time focusing on new strategies, new processes, the new fads, what's the latest thing that we could work on. But the reality is, if the brain is 100,000 years old, it's not likely to change. We don't have to look far to find information or to find best practices that we can apply today. That's a big part of it, and that's why I go back to the human needs. I've often said that the philosophers from and before the New Thought era, the New Thought era would be 1850 or so to about 1940, where it was supported by the advent of the printing press, but this was a time when a lot of the New Thought literature, a lot of the success literature, Law of Attraction was created during that period. Think and Grow Rich was written during that period. The Game of Life, Wallace Wattles, William James, Ralph Waldo Emerson. These were in that period, that New Thought era. If you look at Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on compensation or initiative and self-reliance, they still ring true today. It's not different. What is different is that the philosophers didn't have the brain imaging capability that we do today. They weren't clear on what's actually happening between the conscious and the subconscious. And as a result, there are some people who look at the subconscious as being above, but the name tells you what it is. The subconscious is below the conscious. So part of the work is to put the conscious mind in charge. Now, that's out of scope for this topic, but it is the first 4 areas of the 7 fitness areas. We focus on agency and personal leadership, because in order to apply dynamic leadership, we have to have personal leadership and agency, because if you don't, it's too easy for the leader to be triggered. The brain is 100,000 years old. Dynamic leadership supports all of those theories that you'll look at from the New Thought era. They're all supported by dynamic leadership, which is why I've selected that one. The next one was that 2/3 of our waking hours in a week of a work week are spent at work. So that leaves 1/3 of their waking hours to do everything else: commute, eat, maintenance, shopping, running the household. All of that is crammed into that last third. So this is an important point because it shapes the person. If you look at the work around mirror neurons, we know that our surroundings influence us. If you consider that 2/3 of the waking hours are spent at your place, it suggests that you should be paying attention to culture. And culture is intentional. I've seen leaders that say you can't really do anything about culture, and I think that's misguided. I do think it's very, very difficult once the culture is in place. But if you're a leader of a small business, you very much can do something about culture. You are setting the culture whether you decide or not. And that's how we get into this thinking that you can't do anything about culture. If you don't do anything, the culture is going to form on its own. So the point is, you want to be intentional about that. And then the other one was human needs are going to be met. And they're going to be met whether you do it or not. When you look at compliance, and we've all been there, you try to get somebody to comply with something, it's so easy for them to put in a workaround. And now with artificial intelligence, and I don't want to blame it on artificial intelligence, this is a trend that's been happening where more and more and more information was put at the fingertips of the frontline worker. As that increases, the frontline workers, they have the information that you as a leader need to be competitive. We can't force them to give the best of who they are. we can't make people give the best version of themselves. We can inspire it, and that's where we'll get into intrinsic motivation. But when you try to force compliance, what you get is defiance. I remember working on projects where the idea was to put specific questions and make it a hard stop, that if they didn't put those answers to those questions that they're supposed to ask the customer, they couldn't go on to the next screen. It was not even weeks before frontline people had it tapped down. They were just yes, 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 no, 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 yes, 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 no, no, yes, yes. I see it in the stores where the clerk is supposed to ask the customer, do you want to add your phone? And the clerk will often, they'll say, yeah, just hit skip that. Just hit skip. They don't do the step because they've not chosen that. They don't like that, and so they're going to defy it. Now, you can keep forcing compliance, but now you have somebody watching them. And as long as they're watching them, well, then you start checking. But eventually what happens is you can't fire everybody, and so then you get at a stalemate, and you have the employees defying and leadership wanting compliance. And when you pay attention to it, you get a spike in compliance, and then it goes right back to what it was. So that's just one version. You probably have a version of it for yourself, and that's the one that you should be using. But that's the point. The human needs will be met whether you're making it happen or not. They're going to get that done, and sometimes it looks like people checking out. They're taking care of themselves, right? 2/3 of their waking hours are at work. Effective leadership follows protocols. In other words, there are best practices that are not difficult to figure out. Once you know what those are, you can apply them. Now, one of the things I didn't mention is that this topic, dynamic leadership, paves the way for you to establish a leadership process in your organization. If you're a small business intent on growing and scaling, you have to scale your systems, you have to scale your processes, you have to scale leadership, which means you should have a consistent approach to leading. If you hire a leader and they have a background in command and control, and someone else has a background in participative management, somebody else was in a leadership position, but they were really a manager, they were really told what to do at every step of the way, but yet they had a leader title, but that person is really waiting to be told what to do. They're not calling the shots. They might be a manager, which could even look like an office manager. You want to have a leadership system in your business that you can convey and that you can teach and that you can check. And that's the leadership process. And you want one that'll scale with the organization. Command and control works when you're there watching the people. You may be able to get away with command and control when you have 5 to 10 people. But once you have 100 people, you're not going to be able to watch all of them. But rather than rely on somebody bringing that skill to the table, you can have it taught as part of your dynamic leadership program that is now scalable across the organization. And then the last one, organizations need both operational and project excellence. It wasn't that long ago that you could get away with just operational excellence because you do a SWOT analysis, you create a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You do that analysis, then you create a strategy based on that analysis, and that strategy can be in place for years. And so from an operational standpoint, you don't have to really change. You're tweaking the operational. In an operational mode, this is where people can rely on habit. The organization has habits, and that carries the day. However, now things are changing so rapidly that SWOT analysis may not even survive the time it takes to put the strategy in place. So you have to have project excellence as well to make those pivots. A pivot can be a tweak. It doesn't take much. You don't really lose momentum. But you do have to have a project mindset to layer in the new capabilities while you're still operating. Typically, you're going to need to do some kind of a shift, some kind of a project, and that's where you need the project excellence. You're operating along, and you get to a point where you're starting to run into pressures, and you need to change. That change is a pivot, but you want to approach it as a project. If you don't approach it as a project, what's going to happen is you're probably putting Band-Aids on the old operation, and eventually you're going to create more problems than you're solving. So if you look at these 5 agreements, the brain is greater than 100,000 years old. 2/3 of our waking hours during the work week are at work. Human needs will be met whether you support that or not. Effective leadership follows protocols, and those can be defined, and it makes sense to define them as a small business owner so that you can scale. And then there's operational and project excellence, which are both needed. And it's very obvious in talking with people, you can see if they're biased towards operational or biased towards project. So Myers-Briggs, MBTI, there's a scale, and it's either extrovert or introvert, intuitor or sensor, feeling or thinker, and judger or perceiver. Now, the biggest area of breakdown is in the N and the S, the intuitor and the sensor. And in simple terms, the intuitor is conceptual, abstract, big picture, is looking for what needs to be changed. They're always looking for a better way to do it. And the sensor is more stable, concrete. They're focused on the details. And it's not so much that one can't do the other, it's what they go to first. So the intuitor wants to see the big picture first and then can drill down. And the sensor wants to see the details first and then can go up. And if you've done presentations before senior leadership teams, you've probably experienced where you come in and you're talking about big picture and somebody interrupts you and wants the detail. So the next time you give the detail first and then somebody else interrupts you and they want the big picture. So you have to have a way of doing both. And in your leadership team, I do recommend getting to where you have both intuitors and sensors so that you have a balance. I would argue that your sensors tend to be better in the operational roles and the intuitors tend to be better in the project roles, but it's not an absolute, and I wouldn't put, hang my hat on that. The point is you want to have a mix on your team. If you have a whole leadership team of sensors, you're going to have difficulty with the projects because that's not where they go first. They don't go to, and so if you're not leaning into making the change, by default, you're leaning into staying the same. And that's the issue that you've got to be able to break. There's 3 different areas that we can get into when we talk about needs. You can talk about the 6 human needs. And the 6 human needs would be certainty, variety, connectedness, and significance. And there's 2 more, which I'll get to in a moment. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they were looked at together by Maslow. So this is not separate. You can actually map the 2 together, but the 6 human needs came first and then Maslow's hierarchy of needs came second. This 6 human needs has been popularized again because it's been brought out in as part of various topics. But I'm going to talk about the 6 human needs in a moment, but I wanted you to know that Maslow introduced both of those. If you look here, you have certainty and variety, and these 2 can be looked at as being on continuum. People want certainty, but they also want variety. If you go too far to certainty, then they get uncomfortable because it's not enough change going on. You give them variety, then that gets too difficult, and they want more security because without certainty, you can't have security. And it's relative. Some people will need more security, more certainty than others. The point is that they are in tension. The other 2, connectedness and significance, those are also in tension because the more I'm connected with the group, the less significant I feel. The more significant I am, the less the group is going to want to have me as part of it. This is the whole thing about fraternization, and you see somebody get promoted out of the group and then they're in the group and they get promoted and then they're ostracized. And so then the next 2 are growth and contribution. And the thinking goes that if you focus on growth and contribution, these get taken care of. It's not a perfect solution, but rather than focusing on these, you focus on growth and contribution, and people will find their way to get the connection. They'll find their way to get significance. They'll find their way to get certainty, and they'll find their way to get variety. Then the other one we'll talk about is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have the physical needs first, food, water, rest, shelter. Then you have the security needs. And if you look at it, if you get dropped off on a deserted island, you think about it. What's the first thing you're going to do? You got to find food. You have to find water. You have to find some shelter. And then you need some protection. Maybe you need some weapons if there's large animals there, but something for security. So it's a natural progression. And then there's the love needs. We'll call these relationship needs. He calls them love needs. I'm going to talk about it as social and connectedness, because in the workplace is not really not talking about love. We're talking about connectedness, relatedness, etc. And then we have the esteem, and then you have the self-actualization. And in self-actualization, this is where people are leaning into their purpose. What's interesting about this triangle, our true physical need has such a low bar. Our true security need has such a low bar. Our true love need has such a low bar. You can meet these with simply making a decision. You can decide that my physical needs are met when if I can eat 1 or 2 meals a day, and I have enough water, and I have 5 hours of sleep. I'm just making that up. You could decide what that is. You can decide security. As long as I have this skill, I can always get employment. As long as I can get employment, I know I have enough money to exist. So you can decide but what happens is people let the goalposts move. And then the physical needs, security needs, they get so high. The love need is interesting because if you give love, you actually experience the oxytocin, you actually experience love. The best way to feel loved is to give love. This is why, oftentimes they talk about when people are depressed, one of the things they recommend them doing is to go and get, to volunteer. And then the esteem is the recognition. So this is where we really spend our time in the workplace. We think about the esteem and the self-actualization. And when you look at this hierarchy of needs, you can see what I'm talking about, where people leave money on the table because, yeah, it's nice to have more money, but if more money is not getting them more love or esteem, at some point they've done enough. And so you introduce, this is why maybe you do recognition trips and you allow them to bring their spouse. Now you're tapping into the love need. You do recognition trips and you make it public who made the trip. And again, I like to have a bar and not necessarily a zero-sum game. I don't want it to be the best of, but once you have a target and everybody hits that, anyone who hits that target, and if you make the target too low, that's on you. If you make it too high, you're not going to have people chasing it. It's an art, but you'll get better and better at creating those bars. And then, as I was saying, the self-actualization, and you also get the relatedness up here. And then the last one we'll talk about is the self-determination theory. And this is where I go. I take these two and collapse them. And you can do your research on self-determination theory. Self-determination theory came about, I would say, like 1967. Yes, that was the last century. But again, go back to what I said. The brain is over 100,000 years old. Just because something was in the last century doesn't mean it's obsolete. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Very good book. I think every leader should read it. It still works. Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. It still works. Obviously, the language may change, but the concepts are the same because the brain is the same, essentially. Under self-determination theory, we have 3 needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Now, you don't have to remember all of this as a leader. Focus on making sure that your business environment is autonomy supportive, competence supportive, and relatedness supportive. You're on the right track. You can look at a situation and understand where the tension might be coming from. Listen to what employees are telling you about their concerns, and you can see that they fit into one of these areas. People want to have enough freedom of action with some parameters, because the parameters allow them to focus. But they want to be able to make some decisions and have those decisions play out. Autonomy is so important that it can become an incentive. When somebody gets promoted, that's an example of them getting more autonomy. by getting promoted, they have more freedom of action, they get to make decisions, and people pursue that. Competence, that goes with confidence. The more competent I become, the more confidence I have. And then they go together. But again, people have to believe that their competence is growing. This is why I'm a strong advocate of development plans, because development plans serve both of these. They serve the autonomy supportive, because as you develop and get to new levels, you have more autonomy. They serve the development plans serve competence, because as you learn new skills along the development plan and you demonstrate them, you're demonstrating the competence. It's like being acknowledged and have the confidence gain as well. And then relatedness, think of this as being seen. People need to be seen in the workplace. They need to know this. When you see a leader take credit without giving any acknowledgement to the person who did the work, you see that problem, because they're pulling relatedness out of the equation. That person was not seen. That person was not acknowledged. They know you're the boss, but they just want to know that they're being seen, that they're being acknowledged, that they're part of the team. So these three come together. You don't have to become an expert at it. We're going to talk about self-determination theory. I'll touch on these periodically, but the point is self-determination theory captures the essence of what's going on here, because it's the human needs, and these are what's are necessary for intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic. So extrinsic motivation would be commission, bonuses, recognition, things of that nature. Intrinsic motivation is the person gets pleasure from the activity itself. Now, how does somebody get pleasure from doing work? That's where we'll get into the leadership protocols. There's a way of describing the work. The development plans help. There's leadership language. There's many tools that you have as a leader. And this is why I advocate having a leadership structure or leadership process that everyone abides by. Otherwise, you get a hodgepodge of what's going on here, and you lose the ability to have intrinsic motivation. But trust me, intrinsic motivation is available, and all you need is 10% overlap with somebody's purpose and the work that they're doing. You may not even need 10% overlap. As long as they feel like they're doing something for the greater good, they can find intrinsic motivation. But there's other things too. Gamification, if you think about people playing video games, how they can do that for hours and hours and hours, there's a reason there. There's dopamine at play, and all of that comes into the conversation when we're talking about dynamic leadership. So I'm going to leave it there, but I wanted to set the stage for the 5 agreements, and then in the context of the needs, and we'll do a review of this next week because I think it's an important point and it pulls together everything that we'll be talking about. So with that, we'll see you next week, same time, live on LinkedIn, and then you can find these on the Dynamic Leadership Center's website. All right, we'll see you soon.